video gained traction across social media platforms and overnight received over 7 million views in the first 24 hours. Beth Key's video gave voice to a crisis of identity that many of us have perhaps felt but never would have verbalized. What is the church? What is Christianity all about? And these questions that are raised are valid and valuable, but the conclusions of some are troubling. Many have given up on the church, calling it a lifeless, hypocritical, man-made form of religion. Sure, I love Jesus, but I'm not quite so sure about the church. Now you're probably thinking, Peter, you're preaching to the choir. We showed up to church this morning. But I think we all need to ask the question that is raised by the church's identity crisis. And that is, what is the church? Does church matter? And if so, why? And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to turn our gaze to Jesus and His Word and ask a simple but complex question: why church? My hope for this sermon series over the next 4 weeks during the month of August is that we might rediscover God's vision for the church. And that perhaps our notions about the church might be challenged, strengthened, and renewed by the Spirit of God. So if you have your Bible, I invite you to open back up to that passage that Wendell read moments ago in Matthew chapter 16. And here in Matthew chapter 16, we're going to look at verses 13 to 20. And here we have the first time in the Bible that the word church appears. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. And it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now imagine the scene with me. We enter the narrative of Matthew's gospel at the peak of Jesus' earthly ministry. He's been proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He called out a ragtag group of followers, some fishermen and some tax collectors, and He invited them to be His friends, to be His followers. And so for the last several months, they've been journeying with Jesus. They've heard His teaching. They've seen Him perform miracles. They've seen Him heal the sick, and they've seen that there's something different about Him. And as they journeyed with Him throughout the cities of the countryside of Israel, fans were accumulating. Throughout Matthew's gospel, we see thousands of people flocking to hear Jesus' words, to see His miracles, to perhaps experience His power. And here we find Jesus and the disciples retreating from the crowds. They're up in Caesarea Philippi, which is up at the northern part of Israel. It's kind of like the outskirts. They're getting away out into nature. It's a moment where Jesus is having a moment with His disciples, His inner circle of friends. And He wants to have a DTR with them. You know what a DTR is? Define the relationship. Couples have DTRs. Mary often tells me about our first DTR. We were high school friends, and we had begun spending more and more time together, and we would go out to dinner on a Friday night. It was just things that friends did. And we'd get trips to go get ice cream, and it was beginning to become clear that we were more than friends. And one night, Mary asked a question. What will you tell people when they ask who I am? This is one of those DTR questions. And me, being my non-committal teenage self, not wanting to give in to the connotations of the labels of boyfriend and girlfriend, answered, "I'll tell them you're my princess." I thought it was sweet. I thought it was a good answer, but whenever Mary tells this story, she says, it was sweet, but it wasn't the right answer. And Jesus is having a bit of a DTR with his disciples when he asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied in verse 14, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah and one of the prophets." These were cultural expectations. The nation of Israel were familiar with these names. They were prophets that were proclaiming that a Messiah, a Savior, someone who would come and save his people was coming. But these were prophets that were telling that this would happen. And so it's a bit of a popular opinion that the disciples report here. Some are saying you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets, and we're getting kind of the report from the disciples here. This is what people are saying. But Jesus takes it a step further, and he says in verse 15, "But what about you?" In the original Greek translation, as we have an English translation here, in the original Greek, it is very poignant when it says, "But you, who do you say that I am?" He's distinguishing the personal belief of his disciples from the popular opinion of the crowds. "But you, who do you say that I am?" There's a big difference between reporting what other people say to actually saying what you think, what you believe, to verbalizing who you say that I am. We're in a political election season, and there are many, many voices stating opinions about the presidential candidates. And it is one thing to report what people are saying about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. But it's another thing to report what you're saying about them. You see what Jesus is doing here? He's saying, I asked you first, what do people say that I am? But now I'm asking you, who do you say that I am? And Jesus distinguishes between popular opinion and personal belief. And as the passage goes on, we'll see how this relates to the church today. But the point that Jesus is raising in these two questions is that the church is not about being a fan of Jesus. It's about being a follower of Jesus. Kyle Idleman, he's a pastor out in Kentucky, and he writes about the difference between a fan and a follower. This is what he says. He says, fans don't mind doing a little touch-up work, but Jesus wants a whole renovation. Fans don't come to Jesus thinking tune-up. They do come to Jesus thinking tune-up, but Jesus is thinking overhaul. Fans think a little makeup is fine, but Jesus is thinking makeover. Fans think a little decorating is required, but Jesus wants a complete remodel. Fans want Jesus to inspire them, but Jesus wants to interfere with their lives. Mary and I are excited about the Olympics. We watched the opening ceremony on Friday night, and we are not sports fans at all. But for some reason, when the Olympics come around, we get really, really excited. There's just something about people from all over the world coming together to compete. And so we've been talking like we're sports fanatics. We've been reading some of the articles, even like we're enthralled by this refugee team. It's just really neat. Athletes without a country who've come together under the Olympic flag to compete as refugees. And so I've been talking like I've been following these people all my life, but I've really just read an article about them. And so Mary and I are entering the Olympic Games as fans, as enthused admirers. And many have approached the church in a similar way. I'm into this idea of Jesus. I'm into the idea of love and loving our neighbors and the good. And fans are enthused admirers of Jesus. But followers are dedicated disciples who are willing to let Jesus have a say about their lives. When the Olympics are over, Mary and I probably won't care a whole lot about the athletes that we followed for 2 weeks. And I'm afraid that many in the church approach Jesus the same way. Maybe we come to church on Sunday and we're a fan of Jesus, but when we walk away, it was merely part of the game. Jesus and the church are not about being fans. It's about being a follower. And Jesus, with his disciples, by asking them, "Who do you say that I am?" is trying to make that distinction. Because that's an important question for each of us to answer. What do you say about Jesus? Sure, maybe you can list off some Bible stories about Jesus. Maybe we can recite some Bible verses. But who do you say that Jesus is? When your neighbor, when your coworker says, "Hey, what were you doing this morning on Sunday morning? I noticed you weren't home." What do you say? Fans report the popular opinions about Jesus, but followers report their personal belief in Jesus. And there's a difference there. So Peter answers in verse 16, and he speaks up for the disciples, and he says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, the language that Peter uses here is important. He is saying something crucially important about who Jesus is. The Messiah was the one that Israel was waiting for, the one who would redeem them from their idolatry, from their sin, who would bring ultimately justice and peace for his people. The popular opinion of the crowds that was maybe Jesus was one to point to the Messiah, but Peter says, "You're the one, Jesus." And then he says this, "You're the Son of the living God." Throughout the Old Testament, this is language that is repeated to signify divinity. Peter is getting that Jesus isn't just another man who lived and came and proclaimed good things, who did good things. He is realizing that he is God who has come to his people. And so Peter makes this statement, and Jesus replies in verse 17, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. You see, faith is something that God stirs in our heart. Peter is making a declaration of faith. You are the Messiah. You're the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. I get it, Jesus. You're the one we've been waiting for. And Jesus affirms, you didn't get this by just reading books. You didn't get this by just getting all the facts straight about who Jesus is. There is something, there is a reason why we call the Christian faith faith. Because there is a step of faith that is required where God reveals to us who Jesus actually is. You see, Simon is realizing something that's bigger than himself. And Jesus then invites Peter to be part of something that's bigger than himself. And this is what he says in verse 18. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. In the original language here, Peter is Petros, and rock is Petra. And so Jesus is making a play on words here. He's saying, you are Petros, and on this Petra, I'm going to build my church. Now, there's something that we have to understand about Peter throughout the Gospels is that he's not really the rocky kind of guy. He's a bit of a flippant guy. He's the guy who speaks up when nobody else does. He's the guy who jumps when everybody else is still hesitating. Peter isn't really the grounded kind of guy, and so Jesus is inviting Peter to be something that he's not. Jesus is inviting Peter to be something bigger than himself. This is the first time that we see the word church. It's a word that was used in the ancient Near East as a term of an assembly of people, of called out ones, people who gather together. And later on in the church's history, this would become the name that we use, gathering of Christians. And Jesus uses this word, called out ones. I will build my church. And this is something we have to realize, is that the church is grounded in the identity of Jesus. That's what Jesus is trying to communicate here in this passage, is that the church is grounded in who Jesus is. Jesus says, I will build my church. On this rock, Peter, I don't care that you're not the most foundational guy in the world. I'm going to use you because it's about me. I'm going to build my church. And so Jesus invites Peter to be part of this grand work where Jesus is going to continue his work in the world, and it's about who Jesus is, not about who we are. And it's about who he's calling us to be. You see, Jesus invites Peter, and as we read throughout the New Testament, we see that God used Peter to help establish the early stages of the church. He proclaimed the good news of Jesus on the day of Pentecost, and we see he has a vision of how the gospel would go to the Gentiles, and God used Peter as a foundational person in the church. But I think Jesus is speaking to more than Peter in this passage. He's speaking to us. He's saying, I'm inviting you to be part of something bigger than yourselves. to be part of the work of Jesus continued in this world today. And I want you remember those questions I asked you? Who do you say that I am? I want you to realize that the church is grounded not in who you are, but in who I am. And as we, as the church here in the 21st century, approach what is Christianity? What is the body of Christ? What is this whole wide church? We have to remember that it's about the identity of Jesus and not about our identity. Because when we make it about our identity, we realize that the church is full of hypocrites. It's full of people who are broken and flawed, people who offend their neighbor, people who don't walk like Jesus walked. And when we realize that the church is about Jesus and not about us, we realize, oh, it's okay that I'm broken. It's okay that there are hypocrites in the church because I'm one of them. Because it's about Jesus and what He's calling us to be. Not that I'm the rock. Jesus is the foundation of the church. And notice, as the passage goes on, that it's bigger than we could ever imagine. He says to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." This was a language used of death. The gates of Hades, the gates of hell. Basically, he's saying the church is bigger than life. It's bigger than death. Because the work that Jesus is doing, the work that Jesus accomplished at the cross and through His resurrection, is that He overcame death so that all who put their trust in Him, the church, will experience that the gates of hell can't touch that. He's inviting us to be part of something bigger than Himself. And not only that, but the church is grounded in the authority of Jesus. Look what He says in verse 19. He says, "I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, a lot of people have written a lot of things about what these verses mean. And you'll probably realize that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, takes this passage and interprets it a little differently. And so the Catholic Church understands, they say, oh, on Peter, the church is being built. And so we have the papal line of succession. And so there is an understanding that, Peter has the keys to the kingdom. And I never really understood why in all the jokes, Peter's standing at the gates. And then I read this passage and I was like, oh, that's where they get this. But I don't think that's quite what this passage is teaching. I think what Jesus is teaching is that the church that He's going to use Peter to help establish is going to have authority that's bigger than ourselves. It's bigger than any door that we could unlock ourselves. And this language of keys is language of authority. And He's saying, I'm giving the church authority to be part of a work that's bigger than life. It's part of a work that's inviting people to be part of life beyond this earth. It's inviting the church to be part of Jesus' work of inviting people to have faith in Him so that they might not fear death. The church isn't about being some part of something bigger than ourselves. It isn't a social gathering that it's like, it feels good to be part of a larger team. No, the church is about being something bigger than life. You see, What Jesus wants us to realize, and Matthew records this little story here in Matthew's gospel to teach us this foundational lesson, is that the foundation of the church is the identity of Jesus. And the identity of the church is followers and not fans. The foundation of the church is the identity of Jesus. And when we as a church, when we lose sight of that, that's when we cease to be the church. It's about Jesus, but the identity of the church is about followers. It's not about fans who show up on Sunday to be part of the stadium and be enthused about Jesus. It's about people who want Jesus to rock our world, to have a say about how we live our lives. I'm not a fan of the church. I'm a follower of Jesus. And Jesus promised us in this passage that He will build His church. So as a follower of Jesus, I believe in the church. Because it is in and through the church that God is doing His work in the world today. It's true, Jesus isn't a fan of religion. We see that throughout the Gospels. He's not a fan of rituals and empty practices. But He's the founder of the church. And He's calling us out of the stadium of our comfort and onto the playing field of being a follower. And I believe in the church because I believe in Jesus. The foundation of the church is the identity of Jesus. And the identity of the church is followers and not fans. In 1866, a pastor in Windsor, England, was walking through life with his congregation, and every week they would recite the Apostles' Creed, a statement of faith that the church has recited throughout the centuries, stating who God is, who Jesus is, who the church is. And he found that the ritual of saying this every week had become empty and stale. And so he sat down and started writing a song. He said there's got to be a better way to do this. And he started writing these words. The church's one foundation is Jesus Christ her Lord. She is His new creation by water and the word. From heaven He came and sought her to be His holy bride. With His own blood He bought her, and for her life He died. She is from every nation, yet one o'er the earth, all the earth. Her charter of salvation, one Lord, one faith, one birth. One holy name she blesses, partakes one holy food, and to one hope she presses, with every grace endued. You probably know it as the hymn, The Church's One Foundation. Brothers and sisters, I believe in the church, in the work that God is continuing to do in this world and through the church, because I believe in Jesus. And the identity of the church is about being a follower of Jesus, and not merely a fan. So I wonder what steps in each of our lives we might need to take to move from sitting in the stadium of being a fan of Jesus to get on the playing field and say, Jesus, I want to follow you. And I want to be part of your work that you're doing in the world today. Jesus, I believe in the church.